And in our hearts we long for that day when the Imam will emerge and the Khilafah will be restored. There is a hadith in Sahih Muslim that a Khalifa will die and there will be disagreement concerning succession. Disagreement concerning succession. And then a man will emerge out of Medina and he will hurry to Mecca. And the people of Mecca will come out to him and urge him and try to force him to accept the bay'ah.
Istanbul. Angela, where do you think he's gone to? Well, this is the question that everybody is asking. Jamal Khashoggi, he went missing on Tuesday. He went to the consulate building of Saudi Arabia in Istanbul.
Speaking on Turkish television, Ms. Cengiz explained that he was going to the consulate to collect documents for the marriage.
This is one of the most peculiar, perplexing news events that I can recall in some time.
The evidence keeps building. Newly released video shows a Saudi man who looks a little like Khashoggi.
Here, he's caught on CCTV.
The CIA has looked at it, they've studied it a lot, they have nothing definitive. We are with Saudi Arabia, we're staying with Saudi Arabia. Have a good time, everybody. Thank you.
The president here is positioning himself to be able to not take tougher measures against Saudi Arabia.
Trump's response is a slap in the face to the intelligence community.
Prince Mohammed bin Salman.
The Trump White House had chosen its Saudi friend, and that was MBS.
He was embraced as a reformer.
He sold himself, he sold his vision.
People were mesmerized.
But there was another side.
There were dissidents who were tortured.
They want to put them into a position where they're completely broken and silenced.
Princes and big business people put under constant observation.
He seemed to get more hyper, more intense, more committed to going after his enemies the more powerful he became.
And then the brutal murder of a journalist.
Khashoggi was interrogated, tortured, and murdered.
The Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia.
It is December 2018. It's been less than 3 months since the murder and dismemberment of journalist Jamal Khashoggi. But just outside of Riyadh, Saudi leaders and some of their friends are gathered for a celebration. Featured is a big electric car race intended to showcase the kinds of reforms underway here. There's Adel Al-Jubeir, Saudi Arabia's foreign minister at the time. Mohammed Al-Sheikh, a former World Bank lawyer and now a minister of state. Multi-billionaire Prince Al-Walid bin Talal, among the world's richest men. And over there is Norman Rule, a former senior CIA official. He is talking to the world's largest private collector of Rembrandts, Thomas Kaplan. And of course, there's distinguished royalty, the powerful Mohammed bin Zayed, Crown Prince of Abu Dhabi, Princess Rima, now Saudi Arabia's ambassador to the US, His Royal Highness, Prince Khalid bin Salman, now Deputy Minister of Defense, and his big brother, the Crown Prince himself, Mohammed bin Salman.
I hope I will do that, but if I do that, I will be...
I came here to understand who he is and where he is taking Saudi Arabia. I especially wanted to speak to him about the Khashoggi murder. but we'll come back to that later.
Now, no, we have 0.
For now, His Royal Highness just wants to watch the race below. He wants to put the murder behind him. Much is already known about that day last October when Jamal Khashoggi and his fiancée took a taxi to the Saudi consulate in Istanbul. He entered just after 1 p.m. to pick up some paperwork they needed for their wedding. But when the office closed and Khashoggi had not emerged, word spread.
Here I was, looking at my Twitter feed, and somebody I follow who is close to Jamal saying that Jamal Khashoggi went into the Saudi consulate in Istanbul and he has not gone out. And I remember retweeting that message saying, WTH, what the heck?
A prominent Saudi journalist disappeared in Istanbul.
Jamal Khashoggi, a Saudi Arabian citizen and U.S.
At the time, Khashoggi was a regular contributor to the Washington Post and had written many pieces critical of the Crown Prince.
He was last seen entering the Saudi consulate in Istanbul, Turkey.
Jamal Khashoggi hasn't been seen since.
I was baffled by the idea that he could walk into a consulate and disappear. I couldn't understand who would do that, because even if you wanted to kill a dissident or someone that you felt was a dissident, why would you do it in your own consulate? You lose plausible deniability.
The mystery deepens tonight over the fate of Jamal Khashoggi.
The Saudi government claims that Jamal Khashoggi entered the consulate and left shortly afterwards.
Even among Saudis themselves, people were shocked by it. He's not a political opposition. He didn't ever call for ousting the regime. So it's something that was very much unprecedented.
A Turkish newspaper claimed officials had an audio recording of Khashoggi being tortured.
And a dozen Saudi agents murdered Khashoggi in the consulate.
Khashoggi's body was carved up into little pieces.
It's one thing to know that he'd been kidnapped. It was another thing to know not only had he been killed, but he'd been tortured. For anybody that you've known for a long time to end that way, it just didn't seem right.
Saudi Arabia is scrambling to carry out damage control.
The Crown Prince himself is the principal suspect.
This is a man who we've been trying to understand and cope with. Is he a modernizer or a tyrant?
Prince Mohammed bin Salman is now facing greater scrutiny than ever before. So who is the man in charge of Saudi Arabia?
Our story begins with Prince Mohammed's father, Salman bin Abdulaziz Al Saud. He was born in 1935 and is believed to be the 25th son of the kingdom's founder. He was appointed governor of Riyadh at a young age, a position he held for almost half a century. It was a time of extraordinary change.
Salman, as governor of Riyadh, literally turned a small desert town into a thriving city. There were maybe 100,000 people living in Riyadh when he became governor back in the 1960s. Today, it's somewhere around 7 or 8 million people.
It was during this period of growth that young Mohammed bin Salman, born in 1985, grew up. But little is known about his early years or why his father favored him. He had many sons. He picked this particular son, the oldest of his third marriage. Why?
I understand that the Crown Prince and the King have spent an awful lot of time together, and they have a similar way of looking at the world. The king appeared to groom him to share his view on issues such as corruption. the duties of the royal family, and the responsibilities to sustain the Saud kingdom.
Most young royals study abroad at some point. Not Prince Mohammed. He remained in Riyadh by his father's side through high school and college.
As I understand it, once he graduated, he was employed by his father, working and I assume learning from that work when his father was the governor.
Apparently that's what he did for some years, was attend all of his father's meetings and make himself useful.
Mohammed's father, while governor, had the responsibility of settling disputes within the royal family.
So everybody who had a problem with a rival prince or had a dispute, they will go to him. And he was known to be very, very strict in terms of disciplining princes.
He was known, for instance, to discipline people that he didn't like, including physically slapping people.
He was, according to the stories, famous for calling in princes who refused to pay bank loans and putting them in a rather luxurious villa and pressuring them to pay what they owed, and they did.
And everything that was buried in the closet, he knew about it. And he had helped sweep it under or get rid of it or fix it or whatever. Those files, of course, he has now transferred entirely over to his son, who has all of that information going back literally a half century. This gives them enormous influence within the House of Saud because they know every peccadillo, every fault that every member of the family has had.
In 2015, upon the death of his predecessor, Salman, at age 79, became king. He acted quickly to move his son, Prince Mohammed, into the line of succession. First, Prince Mukran, his predecessor's choice for crown prince, was quickly removed.
No explanation was ever offered. He was just removed and replaced by the then deputy crown prince, Mohammed bin Nayef. Mohammed bin Nayef was a known quantity to the Central Intelligence Agency, to MI6, to every intelligence service around the world.
And MBS is moved up behind him.
Right.
MBS, or Mohammed bin Salman, was now second in line to the throne. He was 29.
The Saudi system is an absolute monarchy. The king's will is absolute. And King Salman decided that MBS is going to be his successor. He shared his views, which are very aggressive, for instance, on Iran. He also has toughness that I think the king didn't see in others.
What do you mean by toughness?
An ability to use coercive power if necessary against domestic enemies and regional enemies. I think the king has a view that Saudi Arabia is a country that cannot be ruled, with kid gloves.
MBS wasted little time in putting his toughness on display. Freshly appointed Minister of Defense, he went on the offensive in neighboring Yemen.
A new offensive to drive out Iranian-backed rebels who seized control of the capital and key military sites.
The Houthi rebels in Yemen were advancing with support from Saudi Arabia's archenemy, Iran. For MBS, this was an urgent national security threat.
Officials say the Saudi campaign was quickly planned, catching top U.S. military commanders off guard.
He went ahead, giving the Obama administration little notice.
Suddenly MBS comes and he says, I'll define our national security interests almost independently. It's not this risk-averse Saudi Arabia that we had gotten used to.
Some elders in the royal family were said to have opposed the offensive, believing it was rash. Crown Prince bin Nayef among them. But young Prince Mohammed prevailed. It became known as MBS's war.
And there was a groundswell of young Saudis that it was like, go, Mohammed, go. This is the first time that Saudi Arabia had ever fought in a war like this outside of their own borders. And it was hugely popular because the way that he framed it was, quick, in and out, we'll fix it, done.
Among the most ardent supporters of the Yemen campaign was this man.
I toast you.
Oh. Jamal Khashoggi.
It is coffee that roasted lightly with cardamom.
With cardamom. And when you drink coffee in Saudi Arabia, where is the coffee from? Is it from Africa?
Originally from Yemen, Al-Mukha.
I asked him why the rush to war in Yemen was necessary, especially in light of reports of many civilian casualties.
If Saudi Arabia waited for Mr. Obama to approve an intervention in Yemen, Yemen would have been gone and lost long time ago. It will be controlled by the Iranians and the Houthi. So we did not wait for Mr. Obama's approval. And I think that empowers Saudi Arabia.
Is Saudi Arabia committing human rights abuses in its bombing campaign?
Look, for Saudi Arabia, it is a 1939 moment.
So you're comparing Iran to Nazi Germany?
Yes. In Saudi Arabia, we are at that moment. We either accept Iranian hegemony, control over Yemen and over our destiny, or freedom.
Let's get more on the Saudi position. I'm joined by Jamal Khashoggi.
At the time, Khashoggi was not a big critic of the regime.
Jamal Khashoggi, welcome back to the program.
He was, for the most part, a pro-government voice.
Jamal was a journalist, an analyst, but also a client of the Saudi government.
An insider.
Absolutely an insider.
Is Saudi Arabia breaking diplomatically?
He's someone you went to understand the politics of the country.
The irony of things that we are almost on total agreements. All what we need
to understand the relationship with Islamism.
Blowing up himself. That is totally absurd in Islam.
He had always worked for one prince or another, was extremely close to Prince Turki al-Faisal, for instance.
He was spokesman for the embassy in London and then in Washington, when I was ambassador in both.
Right. Was he ever somebody, did he complain about the kingdom?
Jamal always had ideas, and he was very, very open with those ideas.
نحن سمو الأمير في المملكة.
نعم.
ليه المملكة العربية السعودية ما تعلن صراحة دعمها للإصلاحيين الإيرانيين؟
يا أخ جمال. He was boisterous. He had a good sense of humor. ولكنها تشكل معضلة. Sometimes laughing at himself, sometimes laughing with others, and he was a very professional journalist.
Let's get another perspective now from Saudi journalist Jamal Khashoggi. He joins me.
In those days, Khashoggi was especially enthusiastic about MBS when he talked about the need for reform.
And he is seen as a savior by young Saudis and by me.
The fact that you have a new king and a young advisor in the person of Mohammed bin Salman, that gave hope to Jamal.
In 2016, after meeting with MBS, Khashoggi made a point of tweeting this. It's the only photograph we've seen of the two of them together. For years, Saudi Arabia has derived most all of its income from oil sales. But oil prices have been falling, the private sector is weak, and youth unemployment is high.
In Saudi Arabia, there was very little change. The economy was highly inefficient. Women played no role. There was a tremendous amount of corruption. It was exactly the sort of place you would expect if you had a government run by elderly men ruling by consensus.
Every single developmental plan, and these started in the late 60s, early 70s, had two main sentences in it: diversing the economy away from oil and less dependence on oil revenues for the government.
It's always been the case. You've always pushed for that, and you've never gotten there.
We've always pushed for that. We've always talked about that, but we were never able to achieve that. This time we were doing something.
The king gave MBS full reign, It was ambitious beyond anything Saudi Arabia had attempted before.
لدينا في اليوم فرص تكاد أن تكون خيالية. فهذا جزء من التحدي أنه نحن تحت الضغط بأن ننجز شيء جديد في وقت قصير.
MBS's plan was to import Western technology, Western entertainment, and to open up the notoriously closed kingdom to become a world-class tourist destination.
The Crown Prince, he has an imagination that I have never experienced anybody with. I'm about 17 years older than he is, but I really look up to him as a leader.
وأهم عنصر لدينا هو الشعب السعودي ورغبة وإرادة الشعب السعودي.
Many who met the young prince were initially impressed.
He was confident, charismatic, decisive, with a vision, not a plan, but a broad sort of, there's the lighthouse I have to get to.
You thought he was a good thing?
I thought he was a good thing. You did say, I'm dealing with a different kind of Saudi than anything I've ever seen.
Mohammed bin Salman planned to finance his Vision 2030 by taking Saudi Arabia's oil giant Saudi Aramco public in an IPO.
The biggest investment banks in the world have been salivating over the prospects.
شركة أرامكو نعمل على هذا الشيء مع عديد من البنوك والمراكز المتخصصة. نتوقع أن يكون تقييم أرامكو أكثر من 2 تريليون دولار. هناك أصول.
To expand the economy, he also needed to introduce some major social reforms.
He stops the religious police from having the right to arrest anyone in public for alleged infringement against public morality. Women, for instance, were often targeted for not being appropriately dressed. Religious police can no longer do anything.
Reforming the religious cultural space, integrating women. These are historic things that leaders were unable to do over the last 50 years.
Out of these changes would come a new Saudi identity.
As they have reined in the religious police, Mohammed bin Salman and the people around him have de-emphasized religion. And in its place has been this idea of that nationalism is most important.
This hyper-nationalist narrative that Saudi Arabia is great.
المملكة العربية السعودية في ال5 سنوات القادمة سوف تكون مختلفة تماماً.
It is in line of what is happening around the world. A new generation of leaders are using the same language and the same rhetoric.
سوف تكون النهضة القادمة في العالم في 30 سنة القادمة في الشرق الأوسط إن شاء الله. هذه حرب السعوديين. هذه حربي اللي أخوضها شخصياً. ولا أريد أن أفارق الحياة إلا وأرى الشرق الأوسط في مقدمة مصاف في العالم وأعتقد أن هذا الهدف سوف يتحقق 100%. الله يعطيك طول العمر يا سيدي.
MBS, not his father the king or Crown Prince bin Nayef, became the emblem of that new Saudi Arabia both here and abroad.
سلم على الوالدة سلم على الوالدة يوم أنا مع الأمير محمد بن سلمان.
But all the changes did not mean that Saudi Arabia would become more politically open or tolerant.
He looked like a very pro-Western, pro-technology guy. What I think was never properly interrogated was what kind of political system did he have in mind?
Politically minded Saudis didn't quite know what to expect. But for them, economic and social changes would be meaningless without real political reform.
عندما أتى الملك سلمان إلى سدة الحكم كنا نتوقع أن يكون هناك على الأقل إفراج عن معتقل الرأي. الملك سلمان لم يكن مثل أشقائه واستمرت المحاكمات السابقة كما هي عليه ثم زاد الكم والنوع في القمع.
What kind of man is Mohammed bin Salman?
محمد بن سلمان هو الشخص الذي يطمح إلى الحصول على السلطة بأسرع طريقة ممكنة. نجح بشكل باهر في الدعاية والإعلان في حملة الPR.
Meanwhile, Jamal Khashoggi continued to be sought after as a commentator. After America's 2016 election, he video conferenced into a U.S. think tank from the Middle East.
Thank you for inviting me. I'm sure Saudi Arabian officials were caught off guard by the election of Mr. Trump.
His comments weren't especially negative, just cautionary.
If we had difficulties with somebody like Mr. Obama, I'm sure we'll have more difficulties with Mr. Trump.
He was advising Gulf governments, including Saudi Arabia, not to put all their eggs in Trump's basket.
The more chaos we have in the region, the more...
But rather to diversify their relations.
Mr. Trump has to choose. He cannot be critical of Iran's nuclear program and not see the chaos they are creating.
It is not clear if he realized he had crossed a red line, but he had. In very clear terms, he told friends and colleagues, Saudi authorities ordered him to no longer write or tweet or appear on TV.
This speech in particular was seen by Mohammed bin Salman as likely to be interpreted as being anti-Trump and his inner circle.
So don't get between me and the Trump administration.
Yes.
The importance of Donald Trump to the Saudis was made abundantly clear in the way they greeted him in Riyadh in May 2017.
The grandeur of this welcome is so different from past presidents.
Really just showing how excited this country is that President Trump has chosen Saudi Arabia to make his first stop. And I want to talk...
It's a huge coup for MBS and King Salman, in that it's able to bring the most powerful person in the world to Saudi Arabia and to rekindle the strategic alliance that had frayed under President Obama. So for MBS, this is a massive victory.
The Saudis used the trip to influence the president on a variety of issues.
And the Saudis knew how to play Donald Trump. They'd seen this kind of person before. In many ways, he's kind of a mirror image of many Saudi princes.
Everywhere you look, there are posters welcoming Donald Trump.
You put his picture up on big posters on the side of skyscrapers.
Pretty amazing welcome ceremony that President Trump is receiving.
You put on the sword dance. You put on a big display.
King Salman bin Abdulaziz Al Saud confers King Abdulaziz Medal on President Donald Trump.
You play to his ego, and he will do what you want him to do.
What the Saudis wanted from Trump was U.S. help in beating back Iran and supporting Saudi ambitions to become the dominant player in the Middle East. In return, MBS made promises to help Trump and his son-in-law Jared Kushner resolve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
Mohammed bin Salman would tell people, I see a Middle East that's going to include Israel. But I'm prepared to recognize Israel, have trade relationships with Israel. And I think that was very seductive to the Trump administration and the centerpiece of the peace plan that Kushner kept trying to push.
The president and his top aides taking steps to solidify relations with the Muslim world.
To give credit to Mohammed bin Salman of his many sought-after accomplishments, the grooming and wooing of Donald Trump has to be pretty close to the top.
During the visit, Trump agreed to an arms deal worth over $100 billion.
We signed historic agreements with the kingdom, and we will be sure to help our Saudi friends to get a good deal from our great American defense companies.
For the Saudis, the trip was a great triumph. They had been reassured that Trump had their back. At the exact same time Trump was in Riyadh, I was in Yemen. The war was in its third year. The Saudis, with U.S. military assistance, were continuing their air campaign. The Iranian-backed Houthi rebels were not retreating. But Prince Mohammed was, as he told me, confident that with just a little more time, he could win here.
We heard bombs and we can't afraid with anything
big.
Anybody
boom like that.
I see the boys of my neighbor died and the blood on the floor.
I visited a Yemeni refugee camp.
المرأة دي بفرح واحدة من عائلتهم ماتوا الناس أتخيلي كانوا يلملموا الشعر من البيوت الرقب من البيوت اليدات النسوان نص.
Why are the Saudis doing this?
الله العالم ما ندريش. نحن ناس فلاحين لا في عندنا معسكر ولا في عندنا حاجة قرية خبط.
خربوا البلاد خربوا حياتنا خربوا عيالنا قتلوا أرملوا النسوان قتلوا جهال يتموا جهال. إيش ذنبهم هذول الناس؟ عشان إيران لها بلد يروحوا لها.
Then, with the war in Yemen at a stalemate, and within weeks of Trump's trip to the region, MBS launched a new foreign policy adventure against another neighbor, the very rich nation of Qatar.
Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, the UAE, among others, broke off diplomatic contact and suspended...
For years, the Saudis had accused the Qataris of financing terrorist groups and being soft on Iran. Now MBS chose to act.
Within a night, Saudi Arabia cut trading routes, transportation into Qatar, they severed diplomatic relations. It was a demand for total capitulation, turning Qatar into a vassal state. It was a very brutal move.
Countries blockading this nation has sent Qatar a 13-point list of demands.
Qatar's been asked to curb diplomatic and trade relations with Iran.
Among their demands was that Qatar shut down its giant state-owned broadcasting network, Al Jazeera.
Saudi Arabia doesn't see why tiny countries like Qatar should have this disproportionate say in the region. So this time, they went for the jugular.
The Qataris have pushed incitement and extremism through their media platforms in order to destabilize countries. This is why we are saying to the Qataris, enough is enough. This has got to stop if you want to have normal relations with us.
Trump tweeted his support of the Saudis, seeming to agree with them that Qatar was funding terrorism. So good to see the Saudi Arabia visit already paying off. Perhaps this will be the beginning of the end to the horror of terrorism. What Trump seemed to have forgotten is that Qatar is a major U.S. ally that hosts the largest American military base in the Middle East. Trump tried to negotiate a settlement, but the Qataris would not cave to Saudi demands.
To the benefit of the countries, they have a tremendous amount of financial resources. They have learned to live without their neighbors. They have weathered the blockade without any kind of major economic problems. They, in fact, have prospered.
But MBS refused to lift the boycott.
He wants to be the most important leader who decides on policies of the region. It's the desire, I think, by MBS to be the dominant regional figure.
MBS was also determined to be the dominant decision-maker at home. One man stood in his way: Crown Prince Mohammed bin Nayef. On the night of June 20th, 2 weeks after the attack on Qatar, bin Nayef was summoned by the king. Saudi TV broadcast this carefully choreographed scene.
Essentially what MBS did was to break the personality and power of MBN, his chief rival, humiliate him, and then make a show of kissing Mohammed bin Nayef's ring as if he was being submissive.
انا بنرتاح الحين وانت الله يعين.
ما نستبعد عن توجيهاتكم ونصحكم الله يسلمك.
موفقين ان شاء الله.
وجبرتكم دوام الله يطول.
موفقين.
الله يعزك. الله يعزك.
Mohammed bin Nayef went along with this little bit of choreography only to be moved into effectively house arrest. Now, it's a nice house, it's a palace, but he's held there incommunicado under essentially palace arrest.
The former crown prince was in charge of Saudi Arabia's security services. He has been relieved of all position.
Within hours of the news, Trump called Mohammed bin Salman to congratulate him.
Mohammed bin Nayef may have been the CIA's best friend, but he wasn't Donald Trump's best friend, let alone Jared Kushner's. The Trump White House had chosen its Saudi friend, and that was MBS.
Overnight, MBS had engineered a hugely successful maneuver. As you understood it, and you're close to the Saudis, how did you understand the need to oust Mohammed bin Nayef?
My sense is that the urgency that the king and the crown prince felt as to the need for changes in the kingdom's economic and political structure was such that it compelled them to make that decision.
With Mohammed bin Nayef removed, the new crown prince, MBS, was now firmly in charge.
He became the guy running the royal court. He became the defense minister, and he had also taken over effective control of the interior ministry from Crown Prince Mohammed bin Nayef. The whole ball of wax was now in the hands of one man in a way that was really unprecedented.
Saudis were already getting a peek at what MBS's reforms would look like. This fun zone had opened inside a Riyadh mall. Along with all the rides and shops is a big multiplex movie theater showing all the latest features. Cinemas were banned for decades, but now MBS's plan was to open 350 theaters across the kingdom. What people weren't seeing at the time was the behind-the-scenes effort to control how much freedom would be allowed.
The changes in the kingdom were going to unleash several different pressures. First, you were going to have thousands of religious police who would say, I oppose this. You would inevitably also have thousands of other Saudis who would say, I want far more than you're willing to give. I think the Saudis made a decision that they needed to somehow manage that.
In Saudi Arabia, 2/3 of the country is under 30, with the largest population of Twitter users in the Middle East.
Saudi was a Twitter country. You know, they expressed themselves on Twitter. They used to call it the Saudi Congress, and Twitter was fairly open.
But when MBS became crown prince, that would change.
MBS began to realize that shaping the debate on Twitter, manipulating the debate, intrusively watching what people were writing and thinking was going to be part of how he would control power.
MBS would pick a close aide, Saad al-Qahtani, to police Twitter. Over time, MBS would rely on him to do much more. That's him at a large software development competition that he organized in Jeddah.
Saudi Federation for Cybersecurity and Programming, you are officially amazing. Congratulations.
Mohammed bin Salman saw in him the kind of Saudi who's interested in high tech, who knows social media, who can promote, Mohammed bin Salman's profile and visions and ideas through this medium.
Qahtani had one of the most influential Twitter accounts in the kingdom. He is also a poet who has composed verse about the royal family. Back in Saudi Arabia, Jamal Khashoggi had not been able to work for months. He could travel, but he was still banned from writing, tweeting, or appearing on TV.
He was still hoping that this decree or order will be reversed. So he said, maybe if I toe the line for a while, then they change. Then I see him later, and still the order has not been changed. I remember him saying, I have to do something about this. Me being at home, not being able to, tweet, write, especially write, is no longer bearable.
What has been described as a coordinated crackdown on dissent in the country. Saudi authorities have carried out arrests of over 40 clerics.
More than a dozen prominent women's activists were arrested for demanding...
Then, in September 2017, Mohammed bin Salman's purges began.
They arrested a huge number of liberal-minded reformers.
Dozens of men and women, writers, academics, business people, and an economist were rounded up.
The Crown Prince is clear. Anybody who goes against him, they're in trouble.
Issam al-Zamil had just returned from the U.S., where he had been part of an official Saudi delegation. But in a series of posts on social media, he had cast doubt on Prince Mohammed's valuation of a Saudi Aramco IPO. That would lead to his arrest. After a year in prison, he was charged for, quote, seeking to stir up sedition in the kingdom through his Twitter account. Prominent religious figures were also arrested. One of the most well-known was Salman al-Auda. Among those outside of the official clerical establishment, does anyone compare to your father in terms of popularity?
None whatsoever. I mean, he's been followed by 14 million followers. The king has 6 or 7 million followers.
At the time of his arrest, the Saudi-led boycott of Qatar was in its 3rd month. In this tweet, al-Auda expressed hope that the two leaders, MBS and the Emir of Qatar, could be reconciled.
He was just praying, and they said literally to him, neutrality in this crisis is treason.
That led to his arrest, in fact.
Yeah, that's why they are seeking death penalty against him right now. For Mohammed bin Salman, these are threats to his absolute authority.
Al-Auda was charged with a total of 37 offenses, including, quote, spreading discord and inciting against the ruler.
He was probably the foremost figure in Saudi Arabia associated with a kind of religious reform current that leaned towards democracy. So whatever the kingdom says they've arrested him for, they've really arrested him for being Salman al-Auda.
Tell me how your father was treated when he was arrested.
He was treated really, really badly. He was blindfolded, handcuffed all the time, even in the cell. Chains were put in his feet. He was interrogated for days continuously without allowing him to sleep.
As reports of the arrests appeared, Jamal Khashoggi's name began surfacing in articles. An editor at the Washington Post took notice.
We were hearing the reports about the crackdown, and I saw Jamal Khashoggi's name being quoted in a few pieces about the situation. And I just figured, well, why not reach out to him? And so I gave him a call.
Khashoggi had recently left Saudi Arabia. When he'd settled in D.C., I sat down to talk with him. Before all our cameras were rolling, he spoke personally for a moment. He told me he was uncertain about what he would do here.
So basically what I'm doing right now is just restructuring my life. I don't want to be a dissident, but in the same time, I don't want to go back home and be silent again. And also I could be banned from traveling.
Soon after, Khashoggi decided what to do. He published his first column in the Washington Post. Saudi Arabia wasn't always this repressive. Now it's unbearable.
He was upset when Salman al-Auda was arrested. He was upset when other activists was arrested. And he kept saying, these are moderate people, these are not the extremists, and they are arresting the moderate people.
I think he was, in some ways, confused about the situation. I mean, he really supported the vision of the reforms that Mohammed bin Salman had. I mean, it was a very personal essay. You see that he was wrestling with his decision to speak out or not. And we decided to translate it into Arabic so that people in the whole Arab world could read it.
Did you recognize at that point that there was any danger in this for him?
Mortal danger? No. Personal sacrifices? Yes, of course.
Then came November. First, the Prime Minister of Lebanon, Saad Hariri, was ordered to come to Riyadh.
He was asked to come to the palace for a meeting, and he was taken away, put in a room.
He's handcuffed, he's
slapped, he's maltreated.
The Saudis charged that Hariri had not done enough to counter Iranian influence in Lebanon. He was put on a Saudi TV channel reading a resignation letter.
A truly remarkable event. Prime Minister Hariri is essentially ordered, more or less at gunpoint, to give up his job.
He says he was resigning because Iran was interfering in Lebanon and fomenting, quote, discord and destruction in the region.
يشهد على ذلك تدخلاتها في الشؤون الداخلية للبلدان العربية.
The kind of aggressive tone against Iran is not something that Hariri has endorsed or will endorse. And so they knew it was a forced resignation.
He was eventually released and would rescind his resignation. But there was more.
Mohammed bin Salman is flexing his political muscle in ways not seen before.
On the very same day Hariri was detained, MBS began rounding up 200 of the kingdom's richest businessmen and most powerful princes.
These are incredible times in Saudi Arabia.
Some of the detainees reportedly held here, Riyadh's glamorous Ritz-Carlton.
Especially the older guard are extremely worried by these changes that are happening.
The Ritz was in essence the Big Bang. It brought in a massive number of people. They were presented with very detailed files of their financial shenanigans and were in essence told, you need to repay what you have taken from the kingdom by exploiting your position or your contacts.
And if they pushed back or they refused to pay, what was the consequence?
They didn't leave.
I have a personal friend who was arrested.
Who was that?
I'm not going to name him, but I mean, he went through in detail. He was brought to the Ritz at 4 a.m. in the morning. He said it was extremely well organized. They checked him in, gave him a medical test, asked him if he had any medicines that he needed, and then gave him a room where the door had to be kept open, but he had full access to room service and a TV. And he was interrogated, I think, for a month. And then he was released. Now, I don't know if he settled anything, but by standards, frankly, I would have rather been arrested like him than be arrested in a jail in America.
They say it's all about corruption. I really don't believe that.
There are others who are whispering about whether this is really about a consolidation of power.
Corruption was pervasive in the kingdom. How can you describe the level of corruption that you were facing, that you were confronted with? How do you make the point?
It was so bad that it was actually truly impacting the development of the country. We're talking about billions and billions and billions of dollars. And when we looked at all the various options, this was probably the best option available. Was it perfect? Absolutely not.
President Trump condoned the roundup. But for Jamal Khashoggi, it wasn't just about corruption. What is absolutely clear after Saturday's night of the long knives is that Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman is centralizing all power within his position as Crown Prince.
He likened MBS to Putin. You just saw things getting worse and worse and worse.
He was very upset by the events at the Ritz-Carlton.
And especially by what happened to Walid bin Talal.
Al-Walid bin Talal, a longtime friend and supporter of Khashoggi's and Saudi Arabia's most famous investor.
Jamal Khashoggi's feeling was, as he would refer to MBS, if this kid was able to go that far and arrest somebody like Walid bin Talal, then there are no bounds to what he's going to do to people like him.
But it would take time for the rest of the world to understand the Ritz-Carlton purge as Khashoggi had. Prince Al-Walid was held for 83 days.
Reports of the Ritz indicates that the Saudi government tortured detainees and coerced.
But as other people were released, reports of abuse and torture seeped out to the press.
Inmates required to sign over their fortunes in order to be released.
Family members of detainees have told reporters that MBS's close aide, Saud al-Qahtani, acted as their interrogator.
What's been pretty clear is that he played a principal role in the Ritz-Carlton being turned into this gold-plated prison. There were gradations of treatment, and the death of at least one person in custody, a general, the story was that he died of a heart attack, but according to family members, he had been beaten severely.
There were reports of harsh treatment, beatings, and even death.
I heard those reports, but I've never seen any reflection of that.
Meanwhile, MBS's war in Yemen had gone from bad to worse. In November 2017, after a Houthi missile landed near Riyadh, the Saudis imposed a blockade, making it impossible for food or fuel to get through. 2/3 of the country's population was already facing food shortages. Hospitals were overwhelmed with an outbreak of cholera. After international pressure, the Saudis eased the blockade, but civilian casualties from air attacks and landmines continued to mount.
شو صار؟ شو كنتي عم تعملي؟ كان انسرح بمونا ورجع قرح بيلا. قطعت رجلي ذاك الساعة.
Spokesman for the Saudi-led campaign in Yemen, Major General Ahmed al-Asiri.
Let me tell you something. When you conduct a military operation, mistake could happen. And there is no single allegation which does not investigate.
Do you have a count of the number of civilian deaths that have resulted from your operation? How many civilians have died as a result?
No, we don't have numbers of civilian death of cause of the Yemeni government.
By the end of 2017, thousands of civilians had already been killed, many more wounded. Despite the rising death toll, when Prince Mohammed arrived at the White House a few months later, President Trump was pushing him to buy more weapons.
We make the best military product in the world, whether it's missiles or planes or anything else. There's nobody that even comes close. Some of the things that have been approved and are currently under construction and will be delivered to Saudi Arabia very soon, and that's for their protection. But if you look in terms of dollars, $3 billion, $533 million, $525 million, that's peanuts for you. Should have increased it.
The visit was the beginning of a nearly 3-week tour of the U.S. Even with his purges and the war in Yemen, Prince Mohammed's popularity as a reformer was reaching its peak.
You'll remember he came to the United States and was lauded, literally from coast to coast.
He will have visited 5 states, 4 presidents, 5 newspapers, uncounted moguls, and Oprah.
He was praised as a revolutionary, as the Saudi reformer, as the head of what would be the Saudi Spring.
Should America, should the world buy what the Crown Prince is selling?
He seems to be sincere.
It was a major PR operation. Part of that operation was Wall Street titans, Silicon Valley, and Hollywood.
The tech people, the movie people, their eyes were quite glittering. There was this new opening of people who hadn't made money there before.
People were mesmerized.
You did have this sit down with MBS, the first
notable journalists in the US. Thomas Friedman has actually embraced him big time.
He's not just leading this from the top down. Whoa, it is exploding from the bottom up.
He also made a point of meeting with Jewish American groups in New York.
To win the support of Jewish leadership, he needed to say something different about Israel and about the Palestinians, and he did.
The Crown Prince says that Israelis should have the right to their own land. This will be the prelude of a new era, new relationship between Saudi Arabia and Israel.
He also granted his first ever American TV interview to 60 Minutes.
His reforms inside Saudi Arabia have been revolutionary.
MBS brought his media advisor along with him, Saad al-Qahtani.
Are women equal to men?
Absolutely. We are all human beings, and there's no difference.
He's pushing through reforms that have expanded freedoms, including those of women. He's a fierce opponent of Iran.
He said women are equal to men. We're gonna lift the women driving ban. We're gonna allow more women in leadership position. So he's saying all the right things, but you can only deceive people that far.
At least 12 women and 3 men were arrested because of their activism. Human rights groups believe the number to be much higher. Khashoggi wrote, "Repression and intimidation are not, and never should be, the acceptable companions of reform." He urged MBS to order the release of Hathlul and the other women who campaigned for women's right to drive. But they were not released. Hathlul's parents were not allowed to start visiting her until months later.
Now the system is actually engaged in collective forms of punishment.
In D.C., Khashoggi was also feeling the wrath of MBS. His son, Salah, the only one of his children still in Saudi Arabia, had been forbidden to travel.
One of the first things he said to me is, "They've put my son on a travel ban, and it's just not fair. He's not political at all, and there's nothing I can do about it."
And my understanding is that he sent a message to Saud al-Qahtani telling him this has come to very low standards, that you are now going after my son. But he received no response from Saud al-Qahtani.
His wife, fearing for her and her family's safety, asked for a divorce.
And that was extremely painful to him.
Jamal was also being harassed on Twitter by Qahtani's notorious army of flies.
What we talked about is, did I know anybody at Twitter to turn it off? It was the bots, the army, the flies.
I can say that there was certainly a sense of animus towards Jamal Khashoggi because of his unrelenting criticism of the kingdom in a national newspaper in the capital of the Saudi's closest partner.
And I think MBS felt genuinely threatened by this Washington Post-supported journalist who was criticizing MBS himself personally.
He talked about the kind of threats he was getting, but he was also heartened by the positive feedback he was getting from Saudis he never met. And people reaching out to him and saying, yes, you are doing the right thing. Yes, you are speaking on all of our behalf. Thank you for doing what you are doing.
And he had, with time, found a new love, someone who shared his interest in Arab politics, a Turkish academic, Hatice Cengiz.
When I saw him the last time, he was happy. He said, well, I'm thinking I'm going to spend more time in Turkey now.
And he kept writing about the prince he had once supported.
I think his ultimate desire was to see his people enjoy some of the same freedoms that he had here in Washington, in the U.S.
He submitted his last article on September 28, 2018.
Over time, I think Jamal felt more and more that independent journalism was the way to achieve what he'd wanted since he was a young man. George Orwell gave as a title of the column that he wrote, "As I Please," meaning I write as I please. Jamal Khashoggi was a version of that. He was somebody who wrote what he thought, wrote what he believed.
Do you think Jamal had any idea that he was playing with fire?
I think that Jamal hadn't fully realized how different this system had become. I think that he thought that this was a regime that didn't draw blood unnecessarily, that did not kill dissidents overseas. And I think he was wrong. He misjudged how things had changed.
He was last seen in Istanbul. Angela, where do you think he's gone to?
Well, this is the question that everybody is asking. Jamal Khashoggi, he went missing on Tuesday. He went to the consulate building of Saudi Arabia in Istanbul.
Speaking on Turkish television, Ms. Cengiz explained that he was going to the consulate to collect documents for the marriage. And for that...
The murder took place on October 2nd. 4 days later, the Saudi Consul General gave a reporter a tour of the consulate. The Saudi story was that Khashoggi had walked out of the building alive.
أحب أن أؤكد أنه المواطن جمال غير موجود في القنصلية والقنصلية والسفارة تبذل جهودها للبحث عنه ونشعر حنا بقلق أزاء هذه القضية.
The Saudis were saying he had gone missing somewhere in Turkey. Turkish officials were furious.
They're like, instead of they're providing answers to us, they're actually saying that, oh, it's your problem now, he's missing in Turkey. That was a tipping point for Turkish officials.
At the pro-government Turkish newspaper Sabah, reporters started getting details from Turkish intelligence and the police. Nazif Karaman.
Olayda kullanılan Suudi Arabistan devletine ait 2 jet olduğu ihbarını aldık. Bir haber kaynağımızdan bu 2 jetin bilgisini aldık.
By the time the reporters had learned about the 2 Saudi planes, the jets had left Istanbul. Then they were told more. Abdulrahman Simsek.
Vahşice bir cinayete kurban gittiğiyle ilgili bilgi verildi. Ben de şunu sordum. Nasıl olur yani? Nasıl bir vahşice cinayet? Böyle bir şey olamaz. Böyle bir cinayet bir diplomatik bir binanın içinde. Ben önce inanmadım.
Yasin Aktay, advisor to Turkey's President Erdogan, heard details of the murder.
When you learned that the police had concluded that he had been murdered,
Can you describe that moment?
That moment was very, very difficult for me. They said me, they're animals. They are animals. They are worse than animals. They killed him like dogs, and he was crying, and I cried.
I just couldn't come to myself for a couple of minutes. I just couldn't believe the fact that they cut him into pieces.
This is one of the most peculiar, perplexing news events that I can recall in some time.
The evidence keeps building. Newly released video shows a Saudi man who looks a little like Khashoggi.
Here, he's caught on CCTV arriving at the consulate wearing...
Surveillance footage showed how the team initially tried to fool the police into believing Khashoggi left the consulate alive.
He walks outside in Khashoggi's clothes and glasses.
But the police immediately spotted what was a body double.
Same clothes, same glasses, same beard, same age and build. Everything but the shoes.
Why did the double not take Khashoggi's shoes?
He took the shoes actually, but he couldn't.
They wouldn't fit.
Yeah, and head of the Istanbul police, he realized that the shoes is different.
The Saudis had clung to the lie that Khashoggi was alive.
It's more drip-fed, uncorroboratable intelligence. It sent Riyadh into a panic.
Then Turkish intelligence revealed they had audio tapes.
Turkish and U.S. officials says the recordings offer proof Khashoggi was interrogated, tortured, and murdered.
The details revealed were gruesome. The audio was not released to the public, but some reporters learned about its contents.
To be honest, I don't think it's something that could really be shared with the public because it just involves so much violence, even though it's just an audio recording.
Cemal Kaşıkçı'yı oturtturuyorlar koltuğa. Sonra ellerini arkadan tutuyorlar. Dizlerine ve ayaklarına 5 kişi duruyor. Arkadan birisi poşeti kafasına geçiriyor. TÜBEYKİ Adli Tıp Kurumu Başkanı onun boğulmasını izliyor karşısında. 5 kişinin Cemal Kaşıkçı'nın üzerine yani gerçekten boğuluyorum diyor. Bırakın diyor. Nefes alamıyorum diyor. Ama maalesef cellatları orada o 5 dakika içinde canını aldı.
Meanwhile, the case for Prince Mohammed's involvement was tightening.
After weeks of denials, Saudi Arabia is changing its tune.
Saudi Arabia now going further, admitting that the killing looks to have been premeditated.
These were not low-ranking figures, so they couldn't have done what they did oblivious to the prince, could they?
The Turkish media had identified all 15 of the Saudis who flew into Istanbul.
Who are these people who are on this 15-man team, one of whom a forensics autopsy expert?
5 of them are reported to have worked under MBS's aide Saud al-Qahtani at the royal court. And one key team member was on the Crown Prince's personal security detail, the alleged ringleader on the ground, Maher Mutreb.
One man, Maher Mutreb, he's been seen traveling with the Crown Prince all over the world, potentially as a bodyguard.
The Saudis have been unclear about who authorized the operation. But they have said one man, General Ahmed al-Asiri, the former spokesman for MBS's war in Yemen, was involved in the planning. You know General Asiri?
Yes.
Do you think he's in any way capable of mounting an operation like this?
On his own? Absolutely not. He wouldn't dream up a plot like this. This is a servant of the state, used to taking orders. It's just not in the nature of how the Saudi bureaucracy works. They got caught red-handed. They attempted to come up with a cover story, but the cover story doesn't add up.
It was carried out poorly, and the cover-up was one of the worst in the history of cover-ups.
There's so many holes in your story. The story that you put out there, even the president in the United States said this is the worst cover-up I've ever seen.
With all due respect, we
We put out the stories as we have it based on the facts that were established. We have never in the history of Saudi Arabia had a situation where a Saudi citizen was murdered. This is not how we operate, and this is not what our values are.
Is there anything about this young prince that worries you?
You know what my only worry is? I've reached an age where I don't know if I'll be around when the fruits of what is happening in Saudi Arabia will be picked. Because I see the kingdom moving in a very, very straight way towards the well-being of Saudis, and hopefully the well-being of the world.
On November 16th, the CIA concluded that Prince Mohammed ordered the murder of Khashoggi. They refused to comment publicly about it, but Secretary of State Mike Pompeo did.
I've read every piece of intelligence, unless it's come in the last few hours. There is no direct reporting connecting the Crown Prince to the order to murder Jamal Khashoggi. And that's all I can say in an unclassified setting.
But immediately after Pompeo's comments, someone leaked a summary of the report to a Wall Street Journal reporter, Warren Strobel.
The CIA has looked at it, they've studied it a lot, they have nothing definitive. We are with Saudi Arabia. We're staying with Saudi Arabia. Have a good time, everybody. Thank you.
The president here is positioning himself to be able to not take tougher measures against Saudi Arabia.
Trump's response is a slap in the face to the intelligence community.
And there was more. It was reported that on the day of the murder, Maher Mutreb made a call. He said, in effect, tell your boss the deed was done.
The phone number that was being called in Riyadh was the Crown Prince's office. Doesn't get much better than that. If you call the White House Situation Room, I come to the conclusion the White House knows what's going on.
The texts don't refer to Khashoggi or say anything about a kidnapping or a murder. But then the NSA discovered they had had some damning evidence all along. They just didn't realize it.
After Khashoggi's killed, the United States intelligence community starts looking backwards, scrubbing intercepts that they had picked up over years.
And they find MBS chatting with Qahtani back in 2017.
Mohammed bin Salman is expressing frustration and annoyance about Khashoggi, saying he's becoming more influential.
Qahtani cautioned Prince Mohammed that any move against Khashoggi was risky and could create an international uproar. MBS scolded Qahtani for being too cautious. And then
there's a conversation between Mohammed bin Salman and another influential advisor, and Prince Mohammed says if we can't bring Jamal back by force, we should show him a bullet.
So that conversation is within an hour before the killing. Mutreb is asking whether or not the trunk of the body will fit into a normal bag. Does it need a stronger bag? How do you disjoint a body? That too is being discussed to Beji. The doctor raises some issues regarding having to cut on the ground because he's never done that. They are seemingly rehearsing, planning the act of killing an hour later.
Since the horrible murder.
With sporting events and big concerts, he is trying to win the hearts of young Saudis. His defenders say that the Khashoggi murder and his campaign against dissent should not outweigh everything else he has achieved.